The storm surge was already at 14 feet when Captain Jake Morrison's voice crackled through the Coast Guard radio. Desperate and strained. Mayday, Mayday. This is Rescue Unit 7. We have 8 souls on board, vessel taking on water, engines failing. We need immediate assistance. But as Hurricane Delilah roared toward the Florida Keys with 140 mph winds, every rescue boat in the fleet was either damaged, grounded, or fighting for their own survival. Every boat except one a weathered 32-foot fishing vessel that the entire Coast Guard station had spent months mocking as a floating piece of junk. They called it the Rust Bucket. Its owner? A 28-year-old marine engineer named Hannah Scott, whose grandfather's hand-built boat was about to prove that sometimes the most ridiculed vessels become legends. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first drops of rain were already spattering against the windows of Coast Guard Station Key West when Hannah Scott guided her boat into the harbor that Tuesday morning. The Sarah May, named after her late grandmother, chugged along at a modest 8 knots, her ancient diesel engine producing a distinctive putt-putt sound that announced her arrival long before she came into view. Chief Petty Officer Derek Thompson was the first to notice her approach from the operations deck. He nudged his colleague, Seaman First Class Marcus Rodriguez, and pointed toward the harbor entrance. "Look what the tide dragged in," Thompson said with a smirk. "Scott's Rust Bucket is back from another one of her scientific missions." Rodriguez squinted through the morning haze at the approaching vessel. The Sarah May was indeed a sight to behold, but not in the way that inspired confidence. Her hull, once painted a vibrant blue, had faded to a mottled gray-green that spoke of decades spent battling salt spray and Florida sun. Rust streaks ran down her sides like tears, and her wheelhouse windows were so salt-stained they appeared frosted. A tangle of makeshift antennas and monitoring equipment sprouted from her cabin roof like metallic weeds, giving her the appearance of a floating science experiment gone wrong. "I don't know why Commander Henderson even lets her dock here," Thompson continued, shaking his head. "That thing's an embarrassment to real boats." What Thompson and the others didn't understand, what they'd never bothered to learn, was that the Sarah May was far more than she appeared. Built in 1987 by Hannah's grandfather, William Bill Scott, a master shipwright who'd learned his trade in the Maine fishing fleet before retiring to the Keys, every inch of the vessel had been crafted with purpose and precision that modern boat builders had forgotten. Bill Scott had spent 3 years constructing the Sarah May in his backyard workshop, using techniques passed down through 4 generations of his family. Her hull was solid fiberglass, but reinforced with a network of oak ribs that he'd steam bent himself. Her keel was deeper than standard sport fishing boats, giving her stability in rough seas that smaller, flashier vessels couldn't match. Most importantly, her engine compartment housed not 1 but 2 power plants, the primary diesel that everyone could hear, and a secondary electric motor that Bill had installed as backup decades before hybrid marine propulsion became fashionable. Hannah had inherited the boat 3 years earlier when her grandfather passed away at age 82. Along with the Sarah May, she'd inherited his detailed logbooks documenting 35 years of fishing, storm riding, and mechanical modifications. Bill Scott had been the kind of man who understood that the ocean didn't care about appearances. It only respected preparation, skill, and boats that could take whatever nature threw at them. But the Coast Guard personnel at Station Key West saw none of this history or engineering. They saw a young woman with sun-bleached brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing faded cargo shorts and a University of Miami marine science t-shirt, piloting what looked like a derelict fishing boat held together with hope and marine adhesive. Hannah had completed her master's degree in marine engineering 18 months earlier and had taken a civilian position with the National Weather Service as a storm tracking specialist. Her job was to deploy monitoring equipment in the paths of developing weather systems, collecting real-time data that helped meteorologists improve their hurricane predictions. It was specialized, important work, but it required a boat that could operate in conditions where others wouldn't dare venture. The Sarah May was perfect for the job, even if nobody else could see it. As she maneuvered toward her usual slip at the far end of the dock, the one reserved for civilian contractors and visiting vessels, Hannah could feel the familiar weight of dismissive stares from the Coast Guard personnel. She'd grown accustomed to the comments over the past year and a half of working out of Key West, the jokes about her antique, the suggestions that she upgrade to something more professional, the barely concealed eye rolls when she submitted her mission reports. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Hayes, the station's executive officer, had been particularly vocal about her concerns. Just 2 weeks earlier, during the monthly contractor briefing, Hayes had suggested that the Weather Service might want to consider more modern platforms for their data collection missions. The implication was clear. Hannah and the Sarah May were liabilities waiting to happen. What stung most about the criticism wasn't the attacks on her boat. Hannah had thick enough skin to handle that. It was the assumption that she didn't know what she was doing, that her choice to use her grandfather's vessel was born from inexperience or financial limitations rather than careful consideration of what actually worked best for her missions. Hannah had actually test-driven 3 different modern boats before deciding to stick with the Sarah May, a sleek 35-foot contender that looked impressive but pounded mercilessly in anything over 3-foot seas, a 40-foot yellowfin that was fast and comfortable, but drew too much water to operate in the shallow areas where she often needed to deploy equipment, a 38-foot Boston Whaler that was nearly perfect except for its tendency to lose electronics when hit by the electromagnetic pulses that often preceded severe storms. The Sarah May, by contrast, had been designed by someone who understood that the ocean was an environment where form absolutely had to follow function. Her deep V-hull cut through waves rather than slamming over them. Her draft allowed her to work in water barely 6 feet deep. Her engine compartment was designed to be accessible from inside the cabin, meaning Hannah could perform repairs while staying dry in rough weather. Most importantly, her electrical systems were hardened against electromagnetic interference, a modification Bill Scott had made after losing a fish finder to lightning in 1993. But explaining these advantages required people to listen. And Hannah had learned that most of the Coast Guard personnel at Key West weren't particularly interested in technical discussions with a civilian contractor who looked barely old enough to drink legally. She secured the Sarah May to the dock with practiced efficiency, running spring lines and adjusting fenders with the automatic precision of someone who'd been handling boats since childhood. Her grandfather had started teaching her seamanship when she was 8 years old, beginning with knots and chart reading before progressing to navigation and boat handling. By the time she was 16, she could dock the Sarah May in a crosswind, better than most weekend boaters with decades of experience. As she shut down the main engine and began her post-mission checklist, Hannah could hear voices drifting down from the operations deck above. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but sound carried clearly across the water in the still morning air. "I'm telling you, Henderson needs to have a conversation with the Weather Service," Thompson was saying. "That girl's going to get herself killed out there in that floating coffin. And then we're going to be the ones who have to explain why we let her operate out of our facility." "Come on, Derek," Rodriguez replied. "She seems to know what she's doing, and her boat's passed all the safety inspections." "Safety inspections don't mean squat when you're dealing with real weather," Thompson shot back. "That thing probably hasn't been in anything worse than a thunderstorm. Wait until she hits her first real blow. She'd be calling for rescue like every other weekend warrior who thinks they can handle conditions they've only read about." Hannah's jaw tightened as she checked the fuel levels and battery charge on her monitoring equipment. Thompson's comment revealed exactly the kind of ignorance that frustrated her most. The Sarah May had been through more real weather than most Coast Guard cutters. Bill Scott had ridden out Hurricane Andrew in 1992, Hurricane Wilma in 2005, and Hurricane Irma in 2017, all while anchored in protected mangrove creeks that larger vessels couldn't access. The boat's logbooks documented encounters with waterspouts, microbursts, and sea conditions that would have overwhelmed the sleek sport fishing boats that Thompson apparently considered more seaworthy, but Hannah had learned not to defend herself against casual dismissal. Her grandfather had taught her that the ocean was the ultimate judge of seamanship and boat design. Everything else was just opinion. "Let your results speak, Hannah," he'd told her countless times. "People who talk the most usually know the least." So she focused on her work, methodically uploading the data she'd collected during her morning deployment run and preparing her equipment for the next mission. The National Hurricane Center was tracking 3 systems in the Atlantic, and the most promising one, a tropical depression designated TD7, was showing signs of organization about 400 miles southeast of the Windward Islands. If TD7 continued to strengthen, Hannah would be heading back out within 48 hours to deploy her monitoring buoys in its projected path. The data she collected would help meteorologists understand how the storm was intensifying and provide crucial information for evacuation planning along the southeastern coast. It was important work, even if the Coast Guard personnel above her didn't understand or appreciate it. And the Sarah May, whatever she looked like to casual observers, was the perfect tool for the job. As Hannah finished her checklist and gathered her gear, she caught sight of her reflection in the boat's pilot house window. Sun-weathered and practical, wearing work clothes instead of a crisp uniform, she looked nothing like the Coast Guard officers who questioned her competence. But she looked exactly like her grandfather had during his decades of working these same waters, confident, prepared, and unimpressed by appearances. Hurricane season was just getting started, and Hannah Scott had a feeling that before it was over, the Sarah May would have opportunities to prove what her grandfather had built into every rivet and reinforcement. When that moment came, the jokes about rust buckets and floating coffins would seem a lot less funny. The storm was coming, and some boats were built for exactly that kind of weather. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 40-8 hours after Hannah's return from her routine monitoring run, Tropical Depression TD7 had a name: Hurricane Delilah. The National Hurricane Center's 5 a.m. advisory painted a picture that made even seasoned meteorologists nervous. Maximum sustained winds had jumped from 45 miles per hour to 85 miles per hour in just 18 hours, a rate of intensification that defied most computer models and suggested the storm was feeding on unusually warm water temperatures in the Gulf Stream. Hannah stood in the cramped weather office at Coast Guard Station Key West, studying the satellite imagery on her laptop while sipping her 3rd cup of coffee since dawn. The storm's eye wall was becoming more defined with each hourly update, and the pressure readings from her monitoring buoys were dropping faster than anyone had predicted. What worried her most wasn't the storm's current strength, it was the trajectory model showing Delilah making a sharp northward turn toward the Florida Keys within 72 hours. Dr. James Kellerman, her supervisor at the National Weather Service, appeared in the doorway carrying a stack of printouts and wearing the expression of someone who hadn't slept in 36 hours. At 62, Kellerman had been tracking hurricanes since before satellite technology made the job easier, and Hannah had never seen him look quite this concerned. "Hannah, we need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. "I just got off a conference call with Miami and Atlanta. Delilah's behaving like nothing we've seen since Camille back in '69. He spread the latest track projections across her desk, his finger tracing a red line that curved ominously toward their location. Current models have her making landfall somewhere between Key Largo and Marathon as a Category 4, possibly Category 5. Storm surge predictions are ... significant. Hannah leaned forward, studying the numbers. Storm surge heights of 15 to 20 feet would put most of the lower Keys underwater and make evacuation from the outer islands nearly impossible once the storm got within 150 miles. What's the evacuation timeline looking like? That's the problem, Kellerman said, rubbing his eyes. Monroe County wants to start mandatory evacuation at 72 hours out, but that only works if we can accurately predict where she's going to hit. The European model has her tracking further west toward Naples. The GFS model shows her stalling offshore and potentially weakening. We need better data from inside the storm system. Hannah understood immediately what he was asking. Standard. Hurricane Hunter aircraft could only fly so deep into a developing storm, and they couldn't deploy monitoring equipment in the shallow water areas where storm surge calculations became critical. But a small boat with specialized equipment could get much closer to the storm's center and place monitoring buoys in locations that would provide real-time data on wave heights, wind speeds, and pressure changes. How close are we talking? She asked, though she already knew the answer would be closer than any sane person would want to get to a major hurricane. The outer bands are about 200 miles out right now, Kellerman said. We need buoy placements at 150 miles, 100 miles, and if possible, 75 miles from the center. The data from those positions would give us the accuracy we need to issue precise evacuation orders. Hannah pulled up the marine forecast on her computer. Seas were currently running 6 to 8 feet with winds at 25 knots, rough but manageable for the Sarah May, but in 18 hours, when she'd need to make the 150-mile deployment, conditions would be significantly worse. In 36 hours for the 75-mile deployment, she'd be operating in seas that would challenge even Coast Guard cutters. I can do the 150 and 100-mile deployments, she said. The 75-mile placement depends on how quickly the storm's moving, and whether I can get there before the seas get too big for safe boat handling. Kellerman nodded, but she could see the worry in his eyes. Hannah, I have to ask, are you sure the Sarah May can handle conditions like this? I mean, she's served you well for routine monitoring, but this is different, Hannah finished. I know, but Dr. Kellerman, my grandfather rode out 3 major hurricanes in this boat. She's been designed and modified specifically for heavy weather operations. I'm more worried about the Coast Guard's reaction when they find out what we're planning. As if summoned by her words, voices erupted from the operations center next door. Through the thin walls, they could hear Lieutenant Commander Hayes speaking in the clipped tones she reserved for serious situations. Negative, I will not authorize civilian vessels to operate in those conditions. The forecast shows sustained winds of 40 knots with gusts to 60 by this afternoon. That's beyond safe operating parameters for recreational craft. Hannah and Kellerman exchanged glances. Hayes was talking about them. Ma'am, with respect, came another voice, Chief. Petty Officer Thompson, the Weather Service contractor, thinks her fishing boat can handle hurricane conditions. Maybe we should let natural selection take its course. The comment hit Hannah like a slap. She'd worked out of this station for 18 months, had proven her competence in dozens of successful missions, and Thompson still saw her as some reckless amateur playing with equipment she didn't understand. Dr. Kellerman's face darkened. That's enough, he said, standing up. Come with me. It's time these people understood exactly what kind of operation we're running here. They walked into the operations center where Hayes, Thompson, and 3 other Coast Guard officers were, clustered around a chart table. The conversation stopped abruptly when they entered, and Hannah could feel the familiar weight of dismissive stares. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, Kellerman said formally, I need to brief you on our hurricane monitoring mission parameters. Hayes looked up from the charts, her expression skeptical. Doctor, I've already explained that we cannot authorize civilian vessels to operate in deteriorating conditions. The safety risks are minimal compared to the risks of issuing inaccurate evacuation orders to 80,000 residents, Kellerman interrupted. Commander, with respect, you're not qualified to assess the seaworthiness of specialized scientific vessels or the capabilities of operators with advanced degrees in marine engineering. The room went completely silent. Hannah had never heard anyone speak to Hayes that bluntly, and the lieutenant commander's face flushed red with anger. Dr. Kellerman, Hayes said slowly, this is a Coast Guard facility, and I have ultimate authority over vessel operations from this port. I don't care what degrees Ms. Scott has. I'm not going to sign off on a suicide mission that will result in us having to risk lives attempting a rescue. Thompson stepped forward, emboldened by his commanding officer's position. Ma'am, maybe we should ask Miss Scott exactly what kind of conditions she thinks that Rust Bucket can handle. Have you ever operated in sustained winds over 30 knots, Miss Scott? Ever been in seas higher than 8 feet? Hannah felt her grandfather's advice echoing in her mind. Let your results speak. But this time, silence wasn't going to be enough. These people were letting their prejudices interfere with a mission that could save thousands of lives. Chief Thompson, she said quietly, the Sarah May rode out Hurricane Andrew with sustained winds of 165 miles per hour and storm surge of 17 feet. She's been in Hurricane Wilma with 120 miles per hour winds and Hurricane Irma with 130 miles per hour winds. Her logbooks document operations in seas up to 15 feet and winds up to 80 knots. She's equipped with dual propulsion systems, electromagnetic shielding, and a hull design specifically intended for heavy weather operations. Thompson's smirk faded as Hannah continued. My grandfather built this boat using techniques developed by Maine fishing families who worked the North Atlantic in conditions that would terrify most recreational boaters. Every modification has been tested in real-world situations that your modern Coast Guard vessels have never encountered, because they're too smart to put themselves in that kind of weather. She turned to Hayes. Commander, I understand your concerns about safety. But now thousands of people are depending on us to provide accurate data for evacuation decisions. The Sarah May is the only vessel at this facility capable of deploying monitoring equipment in the conditions we're facing. You can either authorize the mission or explain to Monroe County Emergency Management why their hurricane tracking data is inadequate. Hayes stared at her for a long moment, clearly struggling between her desire to maintain authority and her recognition that Hannah might be right. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Dr. Kellerman broke the silence. Commander, I'm formally requesting permission for our contractor to conduct scientific operations in accordance with her existing agreement with the National Weather Service. This mission falls under NOAA authority, not Coast Guard operational control. It was a bureaucratic end run that Hayes couldn't easily counter, and everyone in the room knew it. NOAA had federal authority over weather monitoring operations, and the Coast Guard couldn't simply override that authority without cause. Hayes's jaw tightened, but she nodded curtly. Fine, but I want hourly position reports, constant radio contact. And the first sign of equipment failure or safety concerns, she comes back immediately. And Dr. Kellerman, if this goes wrong, it's on your head, not mine. As the group dispersed, Hannah caught Thompson's eye. The chief petty officer looked like he wanted to say something, but he just shook his head and walked away. She could imagine what he was thinking. Another civilian who thinks she knows better than the professionals. But as Hannah walked back to the weather office to finalize her mission planning, she felt the same calm confidence that had carried her through every challenging deployment. The Sarah May had been built for exactly this kind of work, and she'd been trained by the best boat handler she'd ever known. Hurricane Delilah was intensifying, and in 6 hours, Hannah would be heading directly toward the storm's outer bands. The jokes about rust buckets were about to face their ultimate test. Outside, the wind was already picking up, and the first gray clouds of the approaching hurricane were visible on the southern horizon. The real weather was coming, and Hannah, Scott, was ready for it. The Sarah May cut through 8-foot swells with the steady rhythm of a boat built for punishment. Hannah stood at the helm, her legs automatically adjusting to the vessel's motion as she navigated toward the first deployment coordinates, now 60 miles southeast of Key West. The morning sun had disappeared behind a wall of gray clouds that stretched from horizon to horizon, and the barometric pressure had dropped 12 millibars in the past 4 hours, a sure sign that Hurricane Delilah was pulling them into her outer circulation. The marine radio crackled with constant chatter from commercial fishing vessels heading for port, their captains reporting deteriorating conditions and increasingly rough seas. Hannah listened with half an ear while monitoring her GPS and the real-time weather data streaming from her onboard systems. What she heard painted a picture of mounting chaos: boats struggling with engine problems, crews dealing with seasickness, and several vessels already requesting Coast Guard assistance for minor emergencies. But the Sarah May moved through the building seas like she was made for exactly this kind of weather. Her deep V-hull sliced through the wave faces rather than pounding over them, and her twin stabilizer fins, another of her grandfather's modifications, kept her tracking straight even when hit by beam seas that would have rolled lighter boats. Satellite phone buzzed with an incoming call from Dr. Kellerman, back at the weather station. She answered on the second ring, keeping one hand on the wheel. "How are conditions out there?" His voice came through the speaker, slightly distorted by the increasing electromagnetic interference from the storm. "Manageable," Hannah replied, checking her instruments. "Seas are 8 to 10 feet with occasional 12-footers. Winds steady at 35 knots with gusts of 45. The boat's handling it fine, but it's definitely getting sportier." "That's what I was afraid of," Kellerman said. "Hannah, I'm getting pressure from the Coast Guard to abort the mission. Lieutenant Commander Hayes called my supervisor 20 minutes ago claiming that we're endangering civilian contractors for non-essential data collection." Hannah felt a surge of anger. Non-essential? The monitoring buoy she was deploying would provide the most accurate storm surge predictions the Hurricane Center had ever obtained for the Florida Keys. The data could mean the difference between saving lives and losing them to inadequate evacuation timing. "Dr. Kellerman, I'm 40 minutes from the first deployment site," she said. "The weather is well within the Sarah May's capabilities. If Hayes wants to explain to emergency management why their evacuation models are based on incomplete data, that's her choice." A larger wave caught the boat at an angle, lifting the bow and sending spray across the windscreen. Hannah corrected course smoothly, feeling the satisfying bite of the rudder as the boat responded exactly as her grandfather had designed it to. "Understood," Kellerman said. "But Hannah, if conditions deteriorate beyond what you can safely handle, I want you to abort and return to port. No data is worth risking your life. Copy that. I'll check in after the first deployment." She ended the call and focused on the GPS as the first waypoint approached. The monitoring buoy she was about to deploy was a sophisticated piece of equipment worth $45,000, a waterproof cylinder packed with sensors that would measure wave height, wind speed, barometric pressure, and water temperature every 30 seconds for the next 72 hours. The data would be transmitted via satellite back to the Hurricane Center, providing real-time information about the storm's behavior as it approached the Keys. But deploying the buoy in these conditions would require precise boat handling and perfect timing. Hannah slowed the engine and began her approach to the deployment coordinates, watching the wave patterns and waiting for the right moment. The seas had grown confused as different wave trains merged and interfered with each other. Some waves approached from the southeast, driven by the storm's outer bands. Others came from the southwest, remnants of an earlier weather system that hadn't completely dissipated. The result was a chaotic seascape where smooth swells suddenly turned into steep-sided pyramids of water that could catch an unwary boat operator off guard. Hannah had been trained for exactly this kind of situation. Her grandfather had taught her to read wave patterns like a language, to anticipate how different swells would interact and where the brief moments of relatively calm water would appear. She throttled back to idle and waited, studying the rhythm of the seas around her. There a gap between wave sets that would give her perhaps 30 seconds of manageable conditions. She engaged the autopilot to hold her position and moved quickly to the stern where the monitoring buoy waited in its deployment cradle. The buoy was heavier than it looked, and deploying it safely required her to time its release perfectly with the boat's motion. Too early, and it would be crushed against the hull. Too late, and it might be damaged by the deployment arm. Hannah watched the waves approaching, counting the rhythm. 1, 2, 3... She triggered the release mechanism. Just as the Sarah May rose on a swell, the buoy splashed into the water cleanly, its GPS antenna immediately beginning to transmit position data. Hannah watched the readouts on her monitoring screen as the sensors came online one by one. Wave height sensors active, barometric pressure readings nominal, water temperature sensors functioning. Perfect deployment. She returned to the helm and checked her position. The first monitoring station was complete, and she was now heading toward the second deployment site, 80 miles further southeast, deeper into the storm's circulation. The difference in conditions was noticeable within the first hour of travel. Wind speeds increased from 40 knots to 50, with gusts now reaching 60. The wave heights jumped from 10 feet to 14, and the period between waves shortened, creating a more violent, punishing motion that would have been unbearable in a lighter boat. But the Sarah May continued to handle the conditions with the same steady competence she displayed for 37 years. Her heavy displacement hull and low center of gravity kept her stable even when hit by waves that would have capsized smaller vessels. Her engine ran smoothly despite the constant spray and the increasing electrical interference from the storm. Hannah's confidence in her boat was absolute. But she was beginning to understand why the Coast Guard personnel had been skeptical about her mission. These were genuinely dangerous conditions that would challenge even experienced mariners in modern vessels. The difference was that most people had never seen a boat specifically designed for heavy weather by someone who understood that the ocean demanded respect, not just technology. Her radio crackled with an emergency call that made her blood run cold. "Mayday, Mayday. This is the charter vessel Lucky Strike. We are taking on water and our engines have failed. We have 6 souls on board, including 2 children. Our position." Static drowned out the coordinates, but Hannah caught enough to know they were somewhere nearby. She grabbed the microphone. "Lucky Strike, this is the Sarah May. I'm a National Weather Service vessel operating in your area. Please repeat your position." "Sarah May, thank God. Our GPS is down, but we're approximately 15 miles southeast of Marathon. We're in a 38-foot sport fishing boat and we're taking on water faster than our pumps can handle. We need immediate assistance." Hannah checked her chart plotter. She was only 8 miles from that position, and the Coast Guard's nearest vessel was at least 40 miles away in these conditions, probably an hour and a half response time. The Lucky Strike didn't have an hour and a half. She keyed the radio to contact the Coast Guard emergency frequency. "Coast Guard Station Key West. This is National Weather Service vessel Sarah May. I'm responding to a Mayday call from the charter vessel Lucky Strike. 6 souls on board, including children. Vessel taking on water, engines failed. I'm proceeding to render assistance." The response came immediately. "Sarah May, this is Coast Guard Key West. Negative on civilian response. You are not authorized for search and rescue operations. Return to port immediately. We have units en route." Hannah looked at her chart plotter again. The Coast Guard's units en route were struggling through the same heavy seas that were challenging her, but in larger, less maneuverable vessels that couldn't make the speed she could in these conditions. She thought about her grandfather's voice. Sometimes, Hannah, you have to stop asking for permission and start taking responsibility. The Lucky Strike was out there with 6 people, including children, and their boat was sinking. The Sarah May was 8 miles away and built to handle exactly these conditions. Hannah turned toward the emergency coordinates and pushed the throttles forward. Behind her, the Coast Guard continued calling on the radio, ordering her to return to port. Ahead of her, somewhere in the growing storm, 6 people were waiting for help that might not arrive in time. The Sarah May lifted over a 14-foot wave and accelerated toward the horizon, her engine note rising to match the growing wind. For the first time since inheriting her grandfather's boat, Hannah was about to discover what the old vessel could really do. When lives depended on her capabilities, the storm was getting worse, but some boats were built for exactly this kind of weather. Hannah spotted the Lucky Strike through her binoculars, just as a massive wave lifted the Sarah May to the crest of a 15-foot swell. The charter boat was wallowing in a trough between waves, listing heavily to starboard and riding dangerously low in the water. Even from half a mile away, she could see that the vessel was in serious trouble. Her stern was nearly awash, and she wasn't responding properly to the wave action. The scene that greeted Hannah as she closed the distance was worse than the radio calls had indicated. The Lucky Strike was a typical South Florida charter boat, sleek, fast, and designed for calm water fishing trips, not hurricane conditions. Her low freeboard and wide beam might have been perfect for entertaining clients in Biscayne Bay, but in 14-foot seas with wind-driven spray, she was taking on water faster than her bilge pumps could handle. Hannah could make out 6 figures huddled in the boat's cabin area. 2 small forms that had to be the children were wearing oversized life jackets, clinging to what appeared to be their parents. The boat's captain was frantically working on something near the engine compartment, while another man was bailing water with a 5-gallon bucket, a losing battle against the sea pouring over the gunnels with each wave. The Sarah May's radio crackled with the Coast Guard's continued demands for her to abandon the rescue and return to port. But Hannah had already switched to the emergency frequency to communicate directly with the Lucky Strike. Lucky Strike, this is the Sarah May. I'm approaching your position from the northwest. What's your current situation? The response came immediately, tinged with panic and relief. Sarah May, thank God you're here. We've lost both engines' water in the fuel system. Our bilge pumps are overwhelmed, and we're taking on water through the scuppers every time a wave hits us. We've got about 10 minutes before we're going under. Hannah assessed the situation quickly. In these sea conditions, a traditional alongside rescue would be impossible. The 2 boats would be smashed together by the wave action. The Lucky Strike was too far gone to attempt a tow, and there wasn't time to wait for Coast Guard helicopters that couldn't fly in 60-knot winds anyway. That left only one option, transferring all 6 people to the Sarah May, while both boats were being tossed around by 15-foot waves. It was the kind of maneuver that required perfect timing, absolute trust in her boat's capabilities, and a level of seamanship that couldn't be taught in any Coast Guard manual. Hannah's grandfather had performed exactly this kind of rescue 3 times during his decades of fishing these waters. She'd heard the stories countless times, had studied his techniques, and had even practiced the maneuvers during calm weather. But she'd never attempted a transfer in conditions like this. She keyed the radio. Lucky Strike, I'm going to come alongside for personnel transfer. I need everyone in life jackets, and I need your strongest swimmer ready to catch lines and help with the transfer. This is going to happen fast, and we're only going to get one chance. Hannah began her approach, studying the wave patterns and timing her maneuver for the brief moments when both boats would be in relatively stable positions. The Sarah May responded to her commands like she was reading Hannah's thoughts, backing down when needed, surging forward at exactly the right moment, holding her position despite the chaotic seas. The first challenge was getting close, enough for line transfer without the boats colliding. Hannah brought the Sarah May to within 30 feet of the charter boat's port side, matching her speed and heading while maintaining just enough separation to avoid contact. At this distance, she could see the fear on the passengers' faces and the determination on the captain's. Line coming over. Hannah shouted, hurling a floating rope across the gap between the boats. The charter boat captain caught it on the second throw and quickly secured it to a cleat. Now the boats were connected, but they were still rising and falling independently with each wave. Sometimes 15 feet apart, vertically. Hannah had rigged a pulley system on her stern rail, another of her grandfather's modifications that would allow her to control the line tension and help guide people across the gap. But the transfer itself would require each person to grab the line during the brief moment when the boats were closest together and slide across before the next wave separated them again. "Kids first," Hannah called. "I need the smallest one ready to come across on my signal." She watched the wave pattern, counting the rhythm. In heavy seas, there was always a pattern: larger waves followed by smaller ones, brief lulls followed by chaotic water. Her grandfather had taught her to read these patterns like music, to anticipate the moments when the ocean would give her the opening she needed. "Now!" she shouted. The charter boat captain lifted a small girl, maybe 8 years old, and helped her grab the transfer line. For a terrifying moment, she was suspended between the two boats as they rolled in opposite directions. Then the Sarah May and Lucky Strike came together, and Hannah was able to reach out and pull the child safely aboard. 1 down, 5 to go. Second child, a boy who looked about 10, made the transfer on the next favorable wave cycle. He was heavier and more frightened, but Hannah caught him just as the boats began to separate again. 2 adults followed, the children's parents, both making clean transfers despite their obvious terror, but the transfers were taking too long. Each maneuver required Hannah to wait for the right wave sequence, and the Lucky Strike was settling deeper in the water with each passing minute. They had maybe 2 more transfer opportunities before the charter boat went under. The remaining 2 men, the boat's captain and what appeared to be a crew member, were trying to decide who should go first when a rogue wave, larger than anything they'd seen so far, approached from the southeast. Hannah saw it coming and immediately understood the danger. The wave was at least 18 feet high and moving faster than the others, the kind of freak sea that could roll boats or drive them together with crushing force. "Hold on," she screamed, disengaging the transfer line and gunning the Sarah May's engine to get clear of the charter boat. The wave hit the Lucky Strike like a giant fist, rolling her almost completely over before she snapped back upright. Water poured into her cockpit, and when she settled, her gunnels were barely above the surface. She was going down. The 2 remaining men had perhaps 60 seconds before the boat sank beneath them. Hannah spun the Sarah May around and charged back toward the foundering vessel, her engine roaring at maximum power. There was no time for careful maneuvering. Now she would have to get close enough for the men to jump. "Get ready to jump," she shouted as she brought the Sarah May alongside the sinking charter boat. "I can't stay here long." The crew member went first, leaping across the gap just as another wave lifted both boats. He landed hard on the Sarah May's deck but rolled clear of the rail. The charter boat captain hesitated for just a moment, probably thinking about his vessel, his livelihood, his responsibility. "Jump!" Hannah screamed. "Now!" He jumped just as the Lucky Strike's stern disappeared beneath the surface. Hannah caught his hand as he hit the water and hauled him aboard with strength she didn't know she possessed. Behind them, the charter boat slipped beneath the waves with barely a sound, leaving only debris floating on the surface. Hannah counted quickly. 6 survivors, all aboard, all breathing. The rescue was complete. She grabbed the radio microphone with shaking hands. Coast Guard. Station Key West. This is the Sarah May. I have successfully recovered 6 souls from the charter vessel Lucky Strike. Vessel has sunk. All personnel safe aboard my boat. Returning to port, the radio was silent for a long moment. Then, Sarah May, this is Coast Guard Key West. Understood. Good work. We have medical personnel standing by at the dock. And now looked back at the survivors huddled in her cabin. The children were wrapped in emergency blankets, their parents holding them close. The 2 boat crew members were pumping water out of their boots and checking each other for injuries. All 6 were alive because an old fishing boat that everybody called a rust bucket had been exactly where she needed to be when it mattered most. The Sarah May turned toward home, her engine running strong and steady, carrying her human cargo. Through seas that had claimed their boat but couldn't touch her. Grandfather's masterpiece. For the first time in 18 months, Hannah felt like the Coast Guard might finally understand what Bill Scott had built into every inch of the vessel they'd spent so long mocking. The journey back to Key West became a nightmare that tested every modification Bill Scott had ever made to the Sarah May. What had been challenging conditions during the rescue deteriorated into something that bordered on survival as Hurricane Delilah's outer bands caught up with them. Wind speeds jumped from 60 knots to 80, with gusts that Hannah's instruments couldn't accurately measure before the spray obscured the REDOUT stot. The waves had grown from the manageable 14-footers of the rescue to towering monsters that approached 20 feet from trough to crest. Worse, they were no longer the long rolling swells that a skilled boat handler could navigate predictably. These were steep, angry seas with breaking crests that could roll a vessel or drive it under if caught at the wrong angle. Hannah stood at the helm, her legs locked against the violent motion, her hands gripping the wheel with white knuckles as she fought to keep the Sarah May positioned correctly for each approaching wave. Behind her in the cabin, the 6 survivors from the Lucky Strike huddled together in various stages of seasickness and terror. The children had stopped crying an hour ago, not because they felt better, but because they were too exhausted and frightened to make any sound. How much further? Called Tom Brennan, the charter boat captain she'd pulled from the water. He was trying to sound calm for the benefit of his passengers, but Hannah could hear the worry in his voice. 28 miles, she replied, not taking her eyes off the approaching wave. This one was a monster, at least 22 feet high, with a breaking crest that would pound down on them like a waterfall if she misjudged the timing. She angled the Sarah May to take the wave at a slight diagonal, letting the bow cut through the face rather than trying to climb straight over it. The boat shuddered as thousands of gallons of green water cascaded over the foredeck, but her grandfather's design held true. The water shed cleanly from the deck through the scuppers, and the boat's deep keel kept her tracking straight despite the tremendous force of the breaking wave. Hannah's radio had been intermittently functional as the storm's electromagnetic interference increased. But she managed to catch fragments of Coast Guard communications that painted a grim picture of conditions throughout the Keys. Multiple vessels were requesting assistance. Several boats had gone missing, and the Coast Guard's own rescue capabilities were being stretched beyond their limits. Sarah May, this is Coast Guard Cutter Vigilant, came a crackling transmission. What is your current position and status? Hannah grabbed the microphone, timing her response for a moment when the boat wasn't climbing a wave face. Coast Guard Vigilant, this is Sarah May, position approximately 25 miles southeast of Key West, carrying 6 survivors from the charter vessel Lucky Strike. All souls aboard are safe, but we're experiencing severe conditions. Sustained. Winds 80 knots, seas 20 to 25 feet. Sarah May, we're tracking you on radar. Be advised we have multiple vessels in distress in your area. Are you capable of rendering additional assistance? Hannah almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. She was fighting for her life in a boat that everyone had dismissed as worthless, carrying 6 people who would have drowned without her intervention. And now the Coast Guard wanted to know if she could help with other rescues. But as she thought about it, she realized that the question wasn't absurd at all. The Sarah May was currently the only vessel operating successfully in these conditions. The Coast Guard cutters were too large and unwieldy to maneuver safely in the chaotic seas. The rescue helicopters couldn't fly in winds approaching hurricane force. The modern sport fishing boats and pleasure craft that usually handled emergency responses were either damaged, seeking shelter, or already in need of rescue themselves. "Vigilant, what type of assistance are you requesting?" She replied. "We have a 42-foot sailboat with engine failure approximately 15 miles southwest of your position. 2 souls on board. Vessel is reportedly taking on water. Our nearest available units are over an hour away in these conditions." Hannah checked her chart plotter and calculated the heading. 15 miles southwest would take her further from the safety of Key West Harbor and deeper into the storm circulation. The survivors in her cabin were already pushed to their physical and emotional limits. The smart move would be to continue directly to port and let the Coast Guard handle the sailboat emergency with their own resources. But her grandfather's voice was clear in her memory. "The ocean doesn't care about job descriptions, Hannah. When someone needs help, you help them if you can." She keyed the radio. "Vigilant, I can attempt to reach the sailboat, but I need you to relay to Key West that my arrival will be delayed. Also, I'll need medical personnel standing by. Some of my passengers are showing signs of severe seasickness and hypothermia." "Understood, Sarah May. The sailboat is the Wandering Star, white hull with blue trim. They're transmitting on channel 16. And Hannah," the Coast Guard operator paused, apparently realizing he'd used her first name instead of the vessel designation. "Be careful out there. You're doing incredible work." Hannah changed course toward the southwest and immediately felt the difference in the sea conditions. Instead of taking the waves on her starboard bow as she had been, she was now meeting them more directly, which created a much more violent motion. The Sarah May began pitching heavily, her bow rising and falling through arcs of 30 feet or more as she climbed each wave and dropped into the following trough dot in the cabin behind her. She could hear renewed sounds of distress from her passengers. The children were crying again, and one of the adults was being violently seasick. But Tom Brennan, the charter boat captain, appeared at her shoulder. "You're going after another boat," he said. It wasn't a question. "Sailboat with 2 people. Engine failure, taking on water," Hannah replied, fighting the wheel as another massive wave tried to push them off course. Brennan was quiet for a moment, watching Hannah work. She could feel him studying her technique, the way she anticipated each wave and adjusted the boat's heading accordingly. Finally, he spoke again. "I've been running charters out of Key West for 15 years, he said. "I've seen a lot of boats and a lot of captains. I've never seen anyone handle conditions like this." Hannah didn't respond immediately. She was concentrating on a particularly nasty wave sequence approaching from the southeast. 3 large waves in close succession that would require careful timing to navigate safely. "Your grandfather built this boat?" Brennan continued. "Bill Scott," Hannah replied, taking the first wave at a slight angle. 37 years ago. He knew what he was doing. The second wave was larger, and Hannah had to reduce power to avoid burying the bow in the back of the first wave. The timing was critical, too much speed, and they'd submarine into the wave ahead. Too little, and the following wave would break over the stern. "He said the ocean was the ultimate teacher," Hannah sighed, successfully navigating the wave sequence. Everything else was just theory. 20 minutes later, she spotted the Wandering Star through the storm spray. The sailboat was in even worse condition than the Lucky Strike had been. Her mast was broken, trailing rigging and sail in the water. that was causing her to lie beam to the seas, one of the most dangerous positions possible in heavy weather. Each wave was rolling her violently, and her cockpit was full of water. But unlike the charter boat rescue, this one would be more complicated. The sailboat's rigging was creating a deadly tangle of lines and metal that could trap anyone who fell overboard or damage the Sarah May if she got too close. Hannah studied the situation, her mind racing through possible approaches. The standard rescue techniques wouldn't work here. She needed something different, something that would account for the dangerous debris field around the sailboat. That's when she remembered another of her grandfather's stories, a rescue he'd performed in 1994 when a shrimp boat had lost power in a hurricane and was being driven toward a reef. The technique he'd used was unconventional, dangerous, and exactly what the current situation required. Hannah reached for the radio to contact the Wandering Star. She was about to attempt a rescue maneuver that no Coast Guard manual had ever described, using a boat that everyone thought was too old and too crude for serious work. The storm was reaching its full fury, but the Sarah May had proven she could handle whatever the ocean threw at her. Now it was time to find out if her captain was worthy of her grandfather's legacy. The Wandering Star was dying a slow death in the mountainous seas, and Hannah could see that conventional rescue techniques wouldn't work. The broken mast had created a deadly spider web of rigging lines and sailcloth that whipped through the air with enough force to kill anyone caught in their path. The sailboat was rolling so violently that her keel was coming completely out of the water on each wave, and the two people aboard were trapped in the cockpit, unable to move without being swept overboard or struck by the flailing debris. Hannah keyed her radio. Wandering Star, this is the vessel Sarah May. I'm approaching your position for rescue assistance. I need you to tell me about injuries and your boat's condition. The response was immediate and desperate. Sarah May, this is Captain David Chun aboard Wandering Star. My wife, Lisa, is injured, possible broken ribs from being thrown against the cabin when the mast went down. I'm okay but exhausted. The boat's taking on water through a hull breach near the keel, and our bilge pump failed 20 minutes ago. We can't last much longer in these conditions. Hannah circled the stricken sailboat at a distance of 200 yards, studying the pattern of debris and the way the broken rigging was moving with each wave. The technique her grandfather had used in 1994 involved approaching from the leeward side during a brief lull in the wave action, but this situation was more complex. The rigging created a constantly changing hazard zone that made traditional approach angles impossible. Tom, she called to the charter boat captain who had remained at her shoulder, I need you to help coordinate this rescue. Can you handle the radio while I maneuver? Tom Brennan nodded, understanding instinctively that Hannah needed to focus entirely on boat handling. What's the plan? I'm going to use something called a trailing rescue, Hannah replied, adjusting her heading for the first phase of the maneuver. Instead of trying to get alongside the sailboat, I'm going to trail a line behind us and let them grab it as I pass. But the timing has to be perfect. She opened a storage compartment and pulled out 300 feet of floating rescue line, another of her grandfather's modifications that most modern boats didn't carry. One end was already secured to a cleat on the Sarah May's stern. The other end had a large orange float designed to make it visible in heavy seas. Wandering Star, I'm going to make a pass to port of your vessel and trail a rescue line. When I give the signal, one of you needs to grab the line and secure it to your strongest cleat. Do not tie it off permanently, just take a wrap around the cleat so you can release it if necessary. Do you understand? Understood, Sarah May. David will attempt to grab the line. Lisa can't move safely. Hannah began her approach, studying the wave patterns and timing her run for the brief moment when both boats would be in relatively stable positions. The danger wasn't just from the rigging. If she misjudged the approach, the Sarah May could be driven into the sailboat by a wave, potentially sinking both vessels. She deployed the rescue line, watching as the bright orange float trailed behind her boat. The line had to be perfectly positioned when she passed the sailboat close enough for David Chun to grab, but not so close that the boats would collide. "Stand by," she called into the radio as she lined up for the pass. The approach required her to bring the Sarah May within 50 feet of the sailboat's port side, while both vessels were being tossed around by 20-foot waves. Hannah watched the wave sequence, counting the rhythm that had become second nature to her over the years at sea. "Now!" she shouted, throttling up to close the final distance. David Chun lunged for the rescue line as it swept past the sailboat's cockpit. For a heart-stopping moment, he missed the grab completely and nearly went overboard. Then, on the second pass of the floating line, he caught it and quickly wrapped it around the sailboat's primary winch. "Line secured," came the call from the wandering star, but now came the most dangerous part of the operation. Hannah had to use the Sarah May's power to pull the sailboat's bow around, so it was pointing into the waves instead of lying beam to the seas. This would stabilize the vessel enough to attempt a personnel transfer, but it required precise throttle control to avoid snapping the line or capsizing either boat. Hannah slowly added power, feeling the line come tight between the two vessels. The Sarah May's deep keel and powerful engine gave her the leverage she needed, and gradually the sailboat's bow began to swing around. The violent rolling motion decreased as the wandering star aligned with the wave direction, but she was still wallowing dangerously low in the water. "She's taking on water faster now." David Chun's voice crackled over the radio. "The hull breach is getting worse." Hannah realized she had perhaps 10 minutes before the sailboat sank completely. Not enough time for a careful, methodical transfer like she'd done with the charter boat. This would have to be fast and decisive. "Tom, I need you to take the helm," she said, surprising the charter boat captain. "Hold us in position relative to the sailboat, same heading, same speed. Don't let the line go slack, but don't let it get too tight either." "Hannah, I don't know if I can. You ran charters for 15 years, she interrupted. "You understand boat handling. I need to get to the stern to manage the personnel transfer." Tom Brennan took the wheel with obvious reluctance, but Hannah could see from his posture that he understood what needed to be done. She made her way aft, clipping her safety harness to the jacklines her grandfather had installed along the deck dot at the stern. She rigged a second line with a life ring attached to transfer system that would allow the people on the sailboat to cross to the Sarah May one at a time. But getting the transfer line to them would require her to throw it accurately across 50 feet of chaotic water while both boats pitched and rolled unpredictably. Hannah waited for the right wave sequence, then hurled the life ring toward the sailboat. Her first throw fell short, the ring disappearing into a wave trough before David Chun could reach it. She hauled the line back and prepared for a second attempt. The second throw was perfect. The life ring landed directly in the sailboat's cockpit, and David Chun immediately understood what to do. He helped his injured wife into the ring and signaled that she was ready for transfer. "Tell Tom to hold steady," Hannah called to one of the passengers in the cabin. "This has to be smooth." She began pulling Lisa Chun across the gap between the boats, timing the retrieve with the wave action to keep the injured woman from being dragged through the water. The transfer took 3 agonizing minutes as Hannah carefully managed the line tension and Tom fought to hold the Sarah May in position. When Lisa Chun was safely aboard, Hannah immediately sent the life ring back for her husband. But as David Chun prepared to make the transfer, a massive wave larger than anything they'd seen approached from the northeast. "Everybody hold on," Hannah screamed, watching the wall of water bearing down on them. The wave hit both boats simultaneously, lifting them 30 feet into the air before dropping them into a trough so deep that Hannah lost sight of the horizon. The rescue line snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and the wandering star was swept away from the Sarah May as if she weighed nothing. When the boats emerged from the wave's chaos, They were 200 yards apart, and David Chun was still trapped on the rapidly sinking sailboat. The Wandering Star's deck was now awash, and her cockpit was completely flooded. Hannah looked at Tom Brennan, who had somehow held the Sarah May together through the massive wave. His face was pale but determined. "Can we do it again?" he asked quietly. Hannah checked her watch. Maybe 5 minutes before the sailboat went under completely. One chance, no margin for error, and this time she'd have to execute the entire rescue sequence without the benefit of a connecting line. She nodded grimly. "Take us around for another approach. And Tom, this time, we're not stopping until we get him." The Sarah May turned toward the dying sailboat, her engine roaring against the storm. Behind them, 8 survivors waited in the cabin, their lives depending on a boat everyone had called worthless and a captain who was about to attempt something that no Coast Guard manual would ever recommend. The ocean was about to receive its final test of what Bill Scott had built into his granddaughter and her boat. David Chun was standing chest-deep in water when Hannah began her final approach to the Wandering Star. The sailboat's cockpit had disappeared completely beneath the surface, and only her cabin top and part of her mast remained visible above the churning seas. In less than 2 minutes, the vessel would slip beneath the waves, taking with her the man who had spent the last hour watching his boat and his dreams die in the storm. Hannah couldn't rely on lines or conventional rescue techniques. The Wandering Star was too low in the water for anyone to safely grab a thrown rope, and there wasn't time to establish a stable rescue platform. The only option left was a maneuver so dangerous that even her grandfather had only attempted it. Once a direct pickup that required bringing the Sarah May alongside a sinking vessel while both boats were being hammered by 25-foot seas. "Tom, I need you to bring us in fast and hold us there for exactly 30 seconds, Hannah said, moving to the starboard rail where she could reach David Chen when the boats came together. "Any longer, and we risk both boats being driven under by the waves. Any shorter, and I won't have time to get him aboard." Tom Brennan gripped the wheel with white knuckles, his charter boat captain instincts warring with the knowledge that what they were about to attempt violated every rule of safe seamanship. "Hannah, if I misjudge this, you won't," she said with absolute conviction. "You've been handling boats in these waters for 15 years. Trust your instincts." Behind them in the cabin, the 8 survivors had gone completely silent. Even the children seemed to understand that something critical was happening. Lisa Chun, despite her injuries, had pulled herself to a porthole where she could see her husband standing in the water, waiting for rescue that might never come. Hannah clipped her safety harness to the boat's rail and prepared a life ring with a short line attached. If David Chun couldn't make it onto the Sarah May directly, she'd have perhaps one chance to get the life ring to him before both boats were separated by the wave action. "Starting our approach," Tom called, his voice steady despite the circumstances. The Sarah May surged forward, her bow cutting through a wave face as she closed the distance to the sinking sailboat dot. The timing had to be perfect. Hannah watched the wave pattern, counting the rhythm that would give them the brief window they needed. Too early, and they'd arrive during a trough when the boats would be separated by a wall of water. Too late, and the Wandering Star would be completely submerged. 50 yards, Tom called. David Chun saw them coming and began moving toward what was left of his boat's starboard side, struggling through the chest-deep water that filled his cockpit. The broken rigging was still whipping around him, one loose stay barely missing his head as the sailboat rolled in the waves. 30 yards. Hannah could see David's face now, exhausted, frightened, but determined to reach the rescue boat that represented his only chance of survival. Behind him, the Wandering Star's cabin top was beginning to settle lower as air escaped from the vessel's interior. 20 yards. A wave lifted both boats simultaneously, bringing them to the same level for a brief moment before dropping them into separate troughs. Hannah realized that the water level difference between the boats was going to make the pickup even more complicated. At times, David would be 15 feet below the Sarah May's deck level. 10 yards coming alongside now. Tom brought the Sarah May parallel to the sinking sailboat with a precision that would have impressed any Coast Guard instructor. The boats were close enough that Hannah could have reached across and touched the Wandering Star's rigging, but the wave action was keeping them in constant relative motion. "David," Hannah shouted. "On my count, you need to grab the rail and pull yourself up." "Ready?" David Chun positioned himself as best he could in the flooded cockpit, his hands gripping the sailboat's lifeline for support. The water around him was now nearly shoulder deep and rising with each wave that swept over the dying vessel. "1.2. Now, David lunged toward the Sarah May just as a wave brought the boats together. For a terrifying moment, he was suspended between the two vessels, his hands grasping for the Sarah May's rail, while his feet tried to find purchase on his own sinking boat. Hannah grabbed his wrist and pulled with every ounce of strength she possessed. David's weight, multiplied by the boat's motion and the drag of the water, felt like she was trying to lift an anchor. For a heart-stopping second, she thought she was going to lose her grip. Then Tom Brennan appeared beside her, reaching down to grab David's other arm. Together, they hauled the exhausted sailor over the rail and onto the Sarah May's deck just as another massive wave drove the two boats apart. Behind them, the Wandering Star rolled once more and then slipped quietly beneath the surface, leaving only a small patch of debris and air bubbles to mark where the sailboat had spent her final moments. David Chun lay on the deck for several seconds, coughing up seawater and trying to process the fact that he was alive. Then he looked up at Hannah with an expression of profound gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for risking everything to save us." Hannah helped him to his feet and guided him toward the cabin where his wife was waiting. "That's what boats are for," she said simply, "bringing people home safely." As David Chun disappeared into the cabin for an emotional reunion with Lisa, Tom Brennan approached Hannah with an expression of amazement and respect. "I've never seen anything like what you just did," he said. "The way you read those waves, the way you positioned the boat. Where did you learn to handle conditions like this?" Hannah looked out at the storm-tossed seas around them, thinking about all the hours her grandfather had spent teaching her to understand the ocean's moods and patterns. "My grandfather used to say that the sea teaches you everything you need to know if you're willing to listen. He spent 40 years listening to these waters, and he built this boat to handle whatever they could throw at her." Hannah nodded, feeling the Sarah May's steady motion beneath her feet, despite the punishment she'd taken during 2 complex rescues. In hurricane conditions, the old boat was running perfectly. Her engine hadn't missed a beat, her hull showed no signs of stress, and her systems continued to function flawlessly. The radio crackled with a transmission from the Coast Guard. "Sarah May, this is Coast Guard Station Key West. We show you have completed rescue operations for both vessels. What is your current status and position?" Hannah picked up the microphone, her voice calm and professional, despite everything they'd been through. "Coast Guard Key West, this is Sarah May. I have 10 souls on board from 2 vessels, 6 from the charter boat, Lucky Strike, and 2 from the sailboat, Wandering Star. All personnel are accounted for and in stable condition. 1 individual has possible broken ribs and will need medical attention upon arrival. My position is 18 miles southeast of Key West, heading northwest at 8 knots. Outstanding work, Sarah May. We have medical personnel and press standing by at the dock. Estimated arrival time?" Hannah checked her GPS and calculated their speed through the continuing rough seas. Approximately 2 hours, depending on conditions. "Understood. Sarah May, I want you to know that your actions today have been observed by multiple agencies. You've successfully rescued 10 people in conditions that grounded our entire rescue fleet. That's That's exceptional seamanship." The Coast Guard operator paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a tone of professional respect that Hannah had never heard directed toward her before. "Welcome to the ranks of genuine rescue operators, Captain Scott." Captain Scott, not civilian contractor or support personnel. Captain Dot, as the Sarah May turned toward home, carrying her human cargo through seas that had claimed 2 boats but couldn't touch her grandfather's masterpiece. Hannah felt a profound sense of completion. For 18 months, she'd endured jokes about rust buckets and floating coffins. She'd been dismissed as an amateur playing with equipment she didn't understand, but when the ocean stripped away all pretense and revealed what really mattered, the Sarah May had proven herself to be exactly what Bill Scott had designed her to be: a boat that could go anywhere, handle anything, and bring people home safely when all the modern technology failed. The storm was beginning to ease as they approached the Florida Keys, but Hannah Scott and the Sarah May had already weathered the most important test of their lives. They'd faced the ocean's fury and emerged victorious, carrying with them 10 people who owed their lives to a grandfather's wisdom and a granddaughter's courage. The Rust Bucket had become a legend. The dock at Coast Guard Station Key West had never seen anything like the crowd that gathered to await the Sarah May's return. Word of Hannah's rescues had spread through the maritime community with the speed that only extraordinary news can achieve. Commercial fishermen, charter boat captains, Coast Guard personnel, emergency medical teams, and local media representatives lined the waterfront, all waiting to see the Rust Bucket that had accomplished what million-dollar rescue vessels couldn't. D.O. Dr. James Kellerman stood at the end of the pier, his weather monitoring equipment forgotten as he watched the horizon through binoculars. Beside him, Lieutenant Commander Patricia Hayes waited in silence, her expression unreadable but her posture suggesting someone grappling with a fundamental shift in perspective. "There," Kellerman said, pointing toward a distant speck emerging from the gray curtain of the storm's outer bands. "That's her." The Sarah May approached Key West Harbor like a conquering hero returning from battle. Her hull showed the scars of her ordeal scrapes along the waterline where debris had scraped against her, a bent rail where David Chun had been hauled aboard, and salt stains covering every surface from the constant spray of hurricane-force seas. But her engine ran with the same steady rhythm it had maintained for 37 years, and she rode the swells with the confidence of a vessel that had proven herself beyond any doubt. As the boat drew closer, the crowd could see the 10 figures moving around on deck and in the cabin. The survivors from both rescued vessels had emerged to watch their approach to safety, and several were pointing toward the dock with obvious relief and amazement. These were people who had given up hope of seeing land again just hours earlier. Hannah guided the Sarah May toward her usual slip at the far end of the dock, the same berth where she'd been dismissed and ridiculed for 18 months. But this time, the path was lined with people who understood exactly what they were witnessing. Tom Brennan appeared at Hannah's shoulder as she maneuvered the boat into the slip. The charter boat captain who had lost his vessel but found his respect for genuine seamanship looked out at the gathered crowd with wonder. "You know, this changes everything," he said quietly. "After today, no one will ever look at this boat the same way again." Hannah secured the engine and began her shutdown checklist with the same methodical precision she'd always used. "The boat hasn't changed," she replied. "People just finally saw what was always there." The first person to board the Sarah May was Chief Hospital Corpsman Angela Martinez, leading a medical team to assess the survivors. She went immediately to Lisa Chun, whose possible broken ribs had been a constant concern during the journey home. "Ma'am, I'm Chief Martinez. How are you feeling?" Lisa Chun managed a weak smile despite her obvious pain. "Like I've been in a boat accident during a hurricane," she said. "But I'm alive, and that's more than I thought possible 6 hours ago." As the medical team worked, Hannah watched the survivors being helped off her boat one by one. Each person stopped to thank her personally, but it was the words of 8-year-old Emma Watkins, one of the children from the charter boat, that hit her most powerfully. "Miss Hannah," the little girl said, looking up with serious eyes, "my daddy says you saved our lives with your special boat. Is that true?" Hannah knelt down to Emma's level, thinking about how to explain something that she was still processing herself. "Your daddy's right that we all work together to get everyone safely home. And yes, this boat is very special. My grandfather built her to take care of people when the ocean gets angry." Emma nodded solemnly, then surprised Hannah by giving her a fierce hug. "Thank you for taking care of us." As the medical team finished their assessments and the survivors were transferred to waiting ambulances and family members, Hannah found herself facing the gathering crowd of maritime professionals. These were people who had spent their careers on the water, who understood the difference between competent seamanship and genuine heroism. Chief Petty Officer Derek Thompson was the first to approach. The man who had spent months making jokes about rust buckets and floating coffins now stood before Hannah with an expression of professional humility. "Captain Scott," he said formally, and Hannah noticed that he emphasized her newly acknowledged rank. "I owe you an apology. I judged your vessel and your capabilities based on appearances rather than performance. That was unprofessional of me." Hannah studied his face and saw genuine remorse rather than mere political correctness. "Chief Thompson, we all make assumptions. What matters is being willing to change them when the evidence proves us wrong." Thompson nodded, then looked out at the Sarah May bobbing peacefully in her slip. "Would you be willing to conduct a training session for our rescue crews? I think there are techniques and approaches that we could learn from." Before Hannah could respond, Lieutenant Commander Hayes stepped forward. The executive officer who had fought so hard to prevent Hannah's mission now stood before her with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal embarrassment. "Captain Scott, I need to formally apologize for my opposition to your operations. Your actions today have demonstrated capabilities that our standard assessment procedures failed to identify. I've already spoken with my superiors about incorporating unconventional rescue vessels and techniques into our emergency response protocols." Hayes paused, clearly struggling with words that didn't come easily to someone accustomed to being the authority in every situation. "I've recommended you for the Coast Guard's Distinguished Public Service Award," she continued. "It's the highest honor we can bestow on civilian mariners. Your rescues today represent the finest traditions of seamanship and selfless service." The crowd around the dock began to applaud, a sound that started with a few people and grew until everyone present was acknowledging what Hannah had accomplished. But she felt uncomfortable with the attention, remembering her grandfather's advice about letting results speak for themselves. Dr. Kellerman rescued her from the growing ceremony by approaching with a clipboard and a satisfied expression. "Hannah, I've got the preliminary data from your monitoring buoys. The information you collected before the rescues is already being used to refine hurricane tracking models. The data from inside Delilah's circulation is unlike anything we've ever obtained." He paused, looking at the numbers on his clipboard. "Your mission today didn't just save 10 lives, it provided scientific data that will improve hurricane predictions for years to come. That could potentially save thousands of lives in future storms." As the crowd began to disperse and the immediate excitement settled into professional conversations about techniques and procedures, Hannah found herself alone with the Sarah May for the first time since beginning the rescue missions. She walked the length of her boat, checking for damage and assessing what repairs might be needed. The hull was sound. The engine had performed flawlessly, and the structural modifications her grandfather had made 37 years earlier had held up under conditions that would have destroyed lesser vessels. Most importantly, the boat had brought everyone home safely, exactly what Bill Scott had designed her to do. Hannah climbed into the pilot house and opened the logbook where her grandfather had recorded 35 years of fishing trips, storm encounters, and mechanical modifications. On the first empty page, she began writing her own entry. October 15, 2024. Hurricane Delilah rescue operations. Deployed monitoring buoys in deteriorating conditions. Rescued 6 souls from charter vessel Lucky Strike, sunk. 2 souls from sailboat Wandering Star, sunk. All survivors recovered safely. Vessel performed flawlessly in sustained winds 80 knots. Seas 20 to 25 feet. Total time on station, 8 hours, 23 minutes. Grandfather's design validated under extreme conditions. She paused, thinking about everything that had happened and everything that had changed in a single day. Then she added one final line. The Sarah May proved today that real capability isn't about looking impressive. It's about being exactly what's needed when everything else fails. As the sun set behind the clearing clouds of the departing hurricane, Hannah Scott sat in the pilot house of her grandfather's boat, surrounded by the tools and charts of a profession that had finally recognized her worth. The jokes about rust buckets had ended forever, replaced by requests for training sessions and discussions of techniques that might save lives in future emergencies. But the greatest victory wasn't the professional recognition or the awards that would follow. It was the knowledge that when people needed help and the ocean was at its most dangerous, the Sarah May and her captain had answered the call without hesitation. The worthless boat had become a legend, and her captain had found her place in the long tradition of mariners who understood that the sea rewards competence, preparation, and courage above all else. In the growing darkness, the lights of Key West Harbor reflected off the water around the Sarah May, and Hannah could almost hear her grandfather's voice carried on the evening breeze. "Well done, Captain, well done." The rust bucket had proven herself worthy of the Scott family name, and Hannah had proven herself worthy of the boat. Together, they had written a chapter in maritime history that would be remembered every time someone underestimated a vessel or a captain based on appearances alone. The legend was born, and it would live as long as people went to sea in boats. Built for more than just looking good at the dock. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.